Hello, I'm Douglas Murray, and welcome to Uncancelled History. Today I'm talking with the distinguished historian Felipe Fernández-Armesto, and we're going to be talking about the Age of the Explorers. Felipe Fernández-Armesto is the William P. Reynolds Chair of Mission in Arts and Letters at the University of Notre Dame, where he is professor in the departments of History and Classics and the program in the History and Philosophy of Science. His books include his 1996 biography of Christopher Columbus, his book 1492, The Year the World Began, and most recently, Straits, Beyond the Myth of Magellan. Today, on Uncancelled History, we're going to be talking about the Age of the Explorers. First of all, Felipe, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
The Age of the Explorers, it's a world which today is perhaps incomprehensible to a lot of people, particularly to a lot of young Americans, but we get little glimpses into the debate, the world, and we get them in strange eruptions of outrage, usually surrounding Columbus in the United States. In the last couple of years, particularly since the summer of 2020, dozens of statues of Christopher Columbus have been torn down in the United States. There's an endless rolling debate about Columbus Day and whether it should even be called that, whether it should be celebrated. And this isn't new. The Sopranos, 20 years ago, had an episode in which Columbus and the tearing down of a Columbus statue was even then an issue.
Really?
Yes.
And the Sopranos, 20 years ago.
Even the Sopranos, 20 years ago.
Oh, I wish I'd known that before we started this interview. I'd have tried to beat you to citing that example. It's great.
So tell us, first of all, to begin with, why is this such a lively issue? And what is there about Columbus in particular that causes this mass sort of hysteria?
Well, I guess you began by putting your finger on what really matters here, which was the incomprehensibility today of sympathizing with what it was to be like somebody like Columbus, one of those heroes of the age of exploration, because Columbus really didn't know where he was going. I mean, nobody in those days who was engaged in these long-range voyages of exploration, which was a very completely new experience in the history of humankind. Columbus was the first person we know about to make a long voyage of exploration with the wind behind him. That's a really extraordinary fact, because nowadays, whatever yachtsman wants is have the wind behind him. But in those days, you didn't want that. You wanted to sail into the wind because you needed to come back. There's no point in discovering anything unless you get back to tell people about it. So ironically, they always sailed into the wind until Columbus came along and had this extraordinarily daring, audacious, adventurous idea of sailing with the wind behind him. So it was a really risky enterprise. Even if you're going out exploring in outer space nowadays, you actually know where you're going. You've got monitors telling you all the time what's ahead. Nothing like that existed in those days. So we're talking about a level of adventure which really isn't reproducible today. And I sometimes think that's really at the root of why people find it so hard to sympathize with these dead white male explorers. It's almost the worst thing in the world nowadays to be a dead white male explorer. And yet what they did was extraordinarily commendable in terms of the risk that they were willing to take, the adventure that they were willing to embrace, for the innovation that they were willing to back with their lives, because most of them died doing it. Columbus was rather exceptional in that he survived to die in his bed at home. But I guess, the really killing element that has made exploration the object of obloquy today is that it carried with it a terrible legacy of imperialism, of exploitation, of violence, which wasn't necessarily in the minds of the explorers themselves, certainly wasn't in Columbus's mind. He was like everybody else, he was a mixture of virtues and vices, but by the standards of explorers of his day, of regular guys of his day, he was actually, relatively speaking, a quite good guy. But the legacy has poisoned the renown.
What was the 15th century world like that explorers like Columbus came from?
He came from a very humble background, like most explorers, basically in those days. If you wanted to get on, and by God, Columbus wanted to get on, he was really, a man absolutely driven by his ambition to succeed and to arrive socially. It wasn't so much important to him as to get to a particular geographical destination in his explorations. He wanted to arrive socially. And in order to understand that, you've got to understand that he starts from a very humble background. He's a weaver's son. And in those days, if you wanted to get on, if you were lowly born and you want to get on, you basically got three courses: the church, and Columbus, I think, actually considered the church at one point. War, that's a great way of getting on. Or exploration. And Columbus, together with a lot of other, very humble people who are struggling to make it in the acceptance world, chooses the explorer's vocation. And how he does that is he models his life on fictional trajectories. He's a great reader of what we would now consider sort of romantic fiction. The station bookstall or airport bookstall pulp fiction of his day were stories of chivalry, romantic stories of chivalry, the stuff satirized a bit later by Cervantes in Don Quixote. Stories typically of a hero who's down on his luck. He's often a foundling. He really deserves on merit a great place in the world, but the world is against him. And he makes it by going out on chivalric adventures, deeds of daring do. And very often these take place at sea. In fact, that's one of the commonest features of the real bestsellers of Columbus's youth. So he tries to do that. He tries to escape by making a great voyage of exploration by sea. And the usual fade out of these stories is the guy conquers an island, defeats giants and monsters, and so the usual fade out is he marries a princess. And that's the trajectory that Columbus was following. Incidentally, also the trajectory that his father-in-law had followed very successfully, and he had become lord of an island in Portuguese service. So Columbus also had his father-in-law's example to follow, but I think he'd already made up his mind that was what he was going to do, and he based it on his reading of pulp fiction. Unless you know that, you can't understand him. You can't understand what animated him. It wasn't all the stuff that you find in the conventional books. It wasn't religion. It wasn't scientific attitude to the world. It wasn't a desire to increase knowledge, although he did have all those things and he expressed all those things. The real driving force was this social ambition.
What did Europeans of the time know of the rest of the world?
But when you say no, they didn't know. I mean, most of them didn't know anything about it because it wasn't within their experience. And most of the knowledge that they had was kind of vicarious knowledge. It had come through ancient classical Greek and Roman writings, through Arabic literature, which percolated into Europe in the Middle Ages, but very few Europeans had been anywhere else. And, really, except for pilgrims going to Jerusalem, most of the rest of the world was pretty much closed and very hostile. Hostile either because of the adverse elements. It's quite difficult, to get out into the Atlantic because of the adverse winds. It's quite difficult to get overland into Asia or Africa because of the hostile cultures and kingdoms that didn't want Christians in their territory. And pretty much, there were two ways of getting to the Indian Ocean up to Columbus's time. One was by going to Egypt, sailing up the Nile, and taking a camel caravan across the Nubian desert to a port on the Red Sea where you would take a ship, and that would take you into the Indian Ocean. And there were a few people who did that, merchants, missionaries, who sent back reports. A little bit of information was percolating through that way. Or the other way was to cross the Ottoman Empire, but very, very few people were allowed to do that because the Ottomans were very hostile to Christendom and they regarded Christendom as their great enemy.
But what did Europeans think, to the extent they did, was out there beyond the ocean?
Monsters. If you look at the maps of the time, the edges of the world are full of monsters. That's
Literal monsters.
Literally, yes. Sort of guys with heads beneath their shoulders, to quote what Othello says in Shakespeare's play. Dog-headed men, the cynocephali, the skyopods, guys with enormous ears. Creatures, human-like creatures who took nourishment by inhaling. Amazons, So all these strange deformations of normality populated the edges of the world. And you can see that in the maps of the time. They're all depicted there. And people thought about that and kind of believed it because it was in the classical Greek and Roman sources that they say respected. You rightly used the word Renaissance earlier in the interview to describe this period. It was a period when people were looking back to ancient Greece and Rome for all their values, all their norms, and a great deal of their knowledge. And because these monsters were described in ancient legends, people thought that they would really find them out there. That's one of the things you've got to understand when you try to comprehend what happened when these different cultures met, when Columbus goes out to the New World and finds people whom no one had ever suspected, no one in Europe had ever suspected existed. He's really got to ask himself, are these guys really fully human? Are they the monsters? Very interestingly, in one of his reports, he says, these people are just like us and are not monsters, at which he says, I was most surprised. And I just wish people would give Columbus the credit for having overcome those prejudices, those expectations that you're going to find monsters, because we're all the victims of prejudices which come from our reading. Basically, you are what you read, and you map what you read onto your mind, and it prejudices your perception of what you then actually see out there. Very few of us, when we look at the world, see what is really there. We see what we're already prejudiced to expect. I wish people would give Columbus the credit, if for nothing else, at least for overcoming those prejudices and for looking at people on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean and seeing them as people like us, literally.
So how does it come about? Columbus sails off, and what happens?
A terrible journey in which he really doesn't choose the best route out, but the journey, because the winds behind them, and no one has undertaken a long journey with the wind behind them before the danger that they're never going to get home.
With rations for how long, by the way?
I'm so sorry?
On the ship, the rations would have been expected to last for how long?
Oh, they had adequate rations because they were expecting a voyage of much the length that they actually experienced. I mean, Columbus thought it would take him about a month to get to China. You know that he was expecting, or at least, I don't know what he was expecting, that's not really very clear, but he was commissioned by the King and Queen of Spain to go to China. Everybody wanted to go there because that was the richest economy in the world at the time. The wetbacks of the late Middle Ages and early modern period were not people crossing the Rio Grande. They were people crossing the ocean to get to China, India, the Indian Ocean, the rich economies of the world where all the great economic opportunities lay. So that's where he thought he was going. He thought it would take him a month or so. Incredible underestimate, which shows how little people in Europe knew about the rest of the world. No one had sent home an authentic report about China since Marco Polo. So that, that says something back in the 13th century. So they really didn't know what was going on in China. Indeed, Columbus had with him letters from the King and Queen of Spain to the ruler of China, which were addressed to the Great Khan, a title the ruler of China hadn't had since 1368, and this is 1492. So that's how out of date they were in their information about China. But he was expecting it to take him a month, so he had adequate rations on board, although not by our standards, because the rations they had were basically salt, fish, and meat, which went putrid very quickly.
And how many men were with him on?
The biggest of his ships had a capacity for about 50 men. He had 3 ships, say 30 to 50 men on each ship.
And how come he doesn't get to China?
Well, because America's in the way. I mean, that's a very crude way of putting it. But yes, the New World was a sort of obstacle course on the way to the east, and he didn't get there because he grossly underestimated the size of the world. It was a very interesting debate at the time, because people have this weird idea, which I think is just a 19th century joke that people have mistakenly taken seriously, that Columbus proved the world was round. Yeah, of course not. Everybody knew the world was round. In fact, I think there were probably more people who believed in a flat Earth today than there were in the 15th century. We don't have any evidence of anybody who thought the world was flat at that time. Everybody thought it was round. In fact, they overestimated its roundness because they thought it was a perfect sphere. Because why would God create anything that wasn't perfect? So they actually exaggerated the roundness of the world. And Columbus at one point began to think maybe it had a kind of hump in it, that it was shaped like a pear. He ended up not believing the world was round. So all that is rather an irony. But his big mistake was to think that it's much smaller than it really is. And although people had sort of worked out using theoretical mathematics and that the world must be quite big, and I think most geographers at the time estimated roughly the right size. One of Columbus's original features was that he argued against the orthodoxy of his day and postulated a very small world. And if it had been as small as he thought, you could have sailed from Europe to China in about a month, but alas, his estimate was, about 20-25% too small.
So he stumbles on the New World, of course.
Of course, yes.
And what does he think?
He was very conflicted, because at one level, he realized that this wasn't the Orient, that there wasn't anything Chinese about any of this stuff. On the other hand, he was committed by the terms of his contract with the King and Queen of Spain to find a route to China. And all that social ambition depended on his delivering for his patrons. The deal was, if he found the way to China, they'd make him a lord, and they'd give him lots of good rewards and say he would be elevated from his humble birth status, at which he was humbly born, into the world to which he aspired. But he could only do that if he delivered on his contract. So he goes most extraordinary lengths to try and find evidence that he hasn't got to China, but he tries to find evidence that he must have got near it. And that's part of the reason why he was also very conflicted about the people he met. Again, you've got to think about this. You want to understand, for old Columbus, you've got to try and think yourself back into the state his mind was in when he got to the New World. A pretty febrile state, because the danger of never getting home had accumulated throughout the voyage. He hadn't yet found a wind that would take him home. He was at odds with his second in command, who had actually recruited all the guys who were on the ship. So there was a big kind of, credibility gap between Columbus and his crew. He had tried to blind them with science. He'd played around on the voyage with all the latest navigational instruments, which he didn't actually know how to use. He wasn't a man of any really great education. He was sort of autodidact. He'd kind of taught himself. He had no idea really how to work all these navigational instruments. He tried to blind people with science, but I don't think that was likely to work very well with the seasoned navigators and sailors who formed his crew. So he's in a pretty bad state mentally when he gets there. And he's also got, like everybody else, all these prejudices about how the world at the rim is going to be peopled with monsters. So he's on the lookout either for, Chinese guys or monsters, and because he doesn't really find any, and you can see him if you really read the texts, which, alas, very few people do, but if you really read them with the attention that they deserve, you can see Columbus struggling with conflicted images of the people whom he's meeting. At times, he thinks, well, maybe they're not fully human, maybe they are monsters. At times, he thinks, well, are they just kind of savages? At times, he thinks, are they like St. Francis? He was a great devotee of St. Francis, and he wonders whether their nakedness, which is the thing about them which most impressed him and really rather shocked him when he first saw them, was their nakedness really like that of St. Francis when he stripped off in the public square of Assisi as a sign of his dependence on God? Or was it like the innocence of Eden? Was it a sort of pre-lapsarian?
He says this somewhere, doesn't he? One of the letters that is this like Adam and Eve? Have we found Eden?
He mentions directly or indirectly all of these possibilities, including the last, which is that he's in the classical golden age, an age in the past which had been postulated by poets in Greek and Roman antiquity, an age in which people were naked, again, because they were innocent. So all of these ideas are struggling in his mind, and whether he ever fully resolves them, I don't know, but he definitely comes to the conclusion that these are genuinely human people whom he has become human creatures, and that they're, as he puts it, like us.
And give us an idea of what pre-1492 Indigenous society actually was like.
Well, I mean, it was like everywhere else. It was pretty grim if you weren't at the top. And it was a stratified society with its own nobility. I mean, obviously, we're talking about lots of different societies. Columbus, whose navigations, explorations in the New World are fairly limited to the Caribbean and parts of the Caribbean area, encounters a lot of different cultures. But they're all hierarchical, they're all stratified. They all have their top guys and their bottom guys. They all have slavery already or some institution very similar to it. And they're all very conflicted. One of the things that Columbus is very puzzled about is that on the one hand, most of the people he meets seem very welcoming, very friendly, and he's always going on about their innocence, their docility. On the other hand, he notices that many of them have wounds on their bodies, which are, of course, a sign that they were already in a situation of conflict with each other. And on the island of Hispaniola, there are at least 2 rival cultures and lots of rival tribes and peoples. And they're also, at war with people from neighboring islands who raid them and attack them. So there's a lot of violence and a lot of inequality in that society already. And by saying that, of course, I'm not justifying their colonization or imperialism or anything like that, because I think if people want to be conflictive and I'm very content for them to have the culture that they want, but we mustn't kid ourselves into a sort of mythical view that everything in the garden was lovely until the Columbus serpent came along and spoiled it.
And that has become a view, hasn't it, in recent decades? I mean, there are various books in the 90s, others that do present Columbus and the explorers arriving into a continent that is basically Eden, and proving to be the serpent in the garden. The Europeans come in and they bring all these vices into...
It's as much as a myth as the myth of the monsters. These guys weren't monsters, and they weren't perfect. They were people like other people, and their society, like other societies, was a mixture of good and bad.
And so what happens then? Columbus, of course, does two remarkable things. He manages to get there and he manages to get back. What happens when he gets back?
Getting back was even harder because he had to find the right wind. He was very short of provisions. He endured a terrible storm, which he thought was going to be the end of him. He literally, he records his last thoughts thinking that he's going to die. When they finally they finally make land in the Azores, which belongs to a hostile kingdom, the kingdom of Portugal. So they're quite lucky, not just be thrown in jail. That's what happened to a lot of subsequent Spanish expeditions that fell into Portuguese hands. So he eventually gets home, and he's in a kind of race to get home. It's a race with his second in command, because as I mentioned earlier, these two guys never really got on. It's that typical story, isn't it? I mean, when does anybody really get on with his or her second in command? And he knew that if the other guy got home first, he'd tell a story which would be to Columbus's discredit. So he really was in a race to get home. And he just won the race. And when his second in command did get home, providentially for Columbus, he dies. I mean, he's at the end of his tether when he gets back. And the first thing he does when he gets home is to die. So Columbus is left to be able to tell his own story to his own advantage.
What does he tell people about what's just happened?
Well, it's harder to say that than you might think, because the most important single source, which is his first report of his discoveries, was very heavily edited at the Spanish court for publication, because the King and Queen of Spain wanted to get out there the fact that one of their servants had made this new discovery. So they wanted to preempt anybody else, grabbing the spoils. And the report was very heavily edited, and it's quite hard to be sure what in it was actually authentically what Columbus said about himself and what wasn't. But he also left another sort of concoction, a document which has often been mistaken for his sort of shipboard log. It's often called his diary. But that was also very heavily edited after his death by the guy whom I suppose we now call his literary executor, Bartolomé de las Casas, very famous in the history of imperialism, for being a real friend to indigenous peoples and an absolute excoriator of any sort of white male who went over to exploit them. So Bartolomé de las Casas, really important voice for the rights and freedoms of indigenous peoples in the Spanish market. And he heavily edits what survives of Columbus's writings. So it's not absolutely, you've got to be absolutely sure how Columbus expressed what he found. But he had three main objectives, I think, in communicating with his public and with his patrons. The first was to say that he had got somewhere near China, because he had to say that, otherwise you wouldn't have got
otherwise you were in trouble. Yeah.
Secondly, to say that although he hadn't found anything profitable to exploit in these islands, at least he'd found real people with real immortal souls who could be redeemed by Christianity, because that at least was something which the King and Queen of Spain were very committed to, and if they couldn't get any profits from his discoveries, at least they would be gratified by the opportunity for evangelization. So I think those are the two most important things. And the third was to say that even though he hadn't found anything exploitable, he was sure he would if he was given another chance. And he would say he was bidding, for more money, more investment, more patronage to go back and to try and do better the second time round. And perhaps, unfortunately, the monarchs bought that, and they did send him back with a bigger fleet and with 1,000 people to set up a colony.
And of course, he wasn't the only person racing to the New World at this stage, was he?
Well, he was ahead of the game.
He was
Yeah,
ahead of
I
the
mean,
game.
his success, which was, of course, a propaganda success. He hadn't really achieved any of the things he was supposed to achieve. But the fact that he found something and that he was able at least to argue that it could be profitable in the future did lead to a sort of stampede in which people followed him. The King and Queen of Spain banned other people from following up on Columbus's achievement. That was part of their deal with him until 1499. But as soon as the deadline kicked in, lots of other people followed him. And meanwhile, of course, the King of England had tried to get in on the act, thinking that if there was something out there, it must be nearer to England than it was to Spain, because of the curve of the earth. Obviously, the further north you travel, the less distance you have if you're going to try and cross the ocean. So the English tried to get in on the act in 1496, and then by 1499 the Portuguese are also investing in these westward voyages, although strictly speaking the paper said they should leave them to Spain. So there was a lot of competition, but to begin with, Columbus was out there on his own, definitely ahead of the pack.
And what was it like once the sort of scramble began after 1499?
Well, I'm not sure that made a great deal of difference, because the people were bidding to make contact, to find commercial opportunities in different parts of the ocean. And although the Portuguese didn't keep their side of the bargain entirely, the terrain between Spain and Portugal had really been worked out by treaty. So very crudely, Brazil was going to be Portuguese and everything else was going to be Spanish. And that was, putting it very crudely, that was the deal that they made. So the competition, it was already, sort of, it was confined to certain areas, and I don't think it made a great deal of difference to the experience of the indigenous people or of the Spanish colonists.
Did it matter who landed first? I mean, was there a difference between the Spanish or the English or the...
Well, people say this, and of course, because I'm Spanish, but I'm kind of half English, and I now live in the United States. I got no patriotic axe to grind. I'm very neutral about this, and I don't honestly think that the myth about this is true. The myth basically is there's an English myth or an Anglo-Saxon myth or white Anglo-Saxon Protestant myth that the English are best, in the words of Flanders and Swan, and everybody else is morally inferior. And there's a Spanish myth that the English are terribly evil and cruel, and the Spanish are morally superior. Neither of these is true. My own Spanish ancestors and my own English ancestors were equally bad and equally good. And the difference was that the Spanish were operating in a different environment. Because they were first in the game, they got the best part of the winnings. So the areas of the New World that became parts of the Spanish monarchy were relatively rich. They were relatively well populated. They had existing productive economies. They were very habitable for Europeans and Africans. Most of the rest of the New World was a pretty crummy environment for the purposes of the time, with indigenous peoples who didn't have the kinds of economies that would sustain life for European colonists. So the Spanish colonists were able to integrate into existing indigenous societies. English colonists weren't. And that's why in the Spanish world you still have these huge indigenous populations. They were left intact. Their cultures were left pretty much intact except for the religion. That was the only thing. Spaniards wanted them to change. Their languages are intact, their customs, their dress, all of the features of music to a great extent, all the features of the indigenous peoples and cultures in the Spanish part of the New World were left in place by the Spaniards. Not because the Spaniards were nice guys, particularly, but because it suited them economically to preserve what was already there. In the case of the English, of course, they exterminated or expelled the native populations from their colonies. But that's not because they were worse people than the Spaniards. It's because having the native peoples around didn't suit the English. That wasn't the kind of economy they wanted. So they got rid of them.
One of the things, of course, that comes up often with this is the disease that was brought in by Europeans in the wake of this.
Yes, that's morally neutral.
Yeah.
You know, unless COVID really came from a laboratory, you can't really blame the Chinese for it. And obviously, the Spaniards didn't manufacture the diseases that they took with them.
They didn't know anything about the diseases.
They of course, had no idea. They didn't know about the, relative immunization, natural immunization of populations in different places. And indeed, for the Spanish monarchy, those diseases were a terrible disaster for the people who died. Yes. But they were also a terrible disaster for the monarchy, partly because the Spanish monarchs did have a strong sense of Christian responsibility for their subjects. They believed that they were the servants of their people. They believed that the indigenous people of the New World who joined the Spanish monarchy were their lawful, rightful subjects confided to them by God. So they were very worried to find these people dying on them. And it, of course, also was a disaster for the Spanish colonists who needed that labor. The worst thing the Indians, as they called them, the Indios, could do was to die on them. In fact, you can read, lots of documents in which the Spanish colonists are really furious with the people for dying because that was the most unhelpful course of action available to them. And you also find tremendous investment by the Spanish crown in the health of indigenous people. People don't realize this, but the Spaniards built literally thousands of hospitals in their colonies in the course of the first 3 centuries of occupation. And those hospitals existed overwhelmingly for the indigenous people and also for black people. If you were a rich white person, you didn't go to hospital. You had the doctor come to you. But those hospitals existed essentially for the poor. And that was a tremendous investment. No other monarchy of the time, no other state of the time, made anything like that investment in the health of its subjects. You don't find a sort of, public health program. I suppose the last thing to say about disease is that this was the normality of the day. This was the age of plague and cold. Really, around the world, especially in the northern hemisphere, one of the amazing things about all these voyages of exploration and stuff is that they happened in a time when the world was gripped by plague and cold. This was a relatively cold period in the history of the world, when people were enduring really terrible conditions, especially in winter, and when plague was absolutely rife. It was the normal annual occurrence in European cities. And in a strange way, you could say that what the Spaniards did when they went to the New World was they exported the age of plague to the Americas with devastating effects. And although the diseases that afflicted the indigenous people were different from those that afflicted people in Europe, because the people in Europe become immunized to smallpox, which was the biggest single killer in the Americas. In spite of that, you find a sort of convergence in which plague becomes normal on both sides of the Atlantic. And there's a terrible fact about plague which people don't understand, which is that it's terrible for you if you die. But an even more terrible fact is it's great for the guys who survive, because it means there are more resources to divvy up amongst fewer people. And one of the shocking truths about the colonial period in the history of the Americas, in the Spanish part of the Americas, the fact that people don't appreciate, because they don't really know it, they haven't taken it on board, is that actually an awful lot of indigenous people were enriched by the effects of the demographic disaster, because they emerged from it with more land, more economic opportunities.
Of course, Columbus is perhaps the most famous household name today from the age of the explorers. You've recently written a book about another of the most famous explorers of the age. Tell us a bit about that and why your subject there is slightly under the radar of the current era.
Well, thank you very much for mentioning my latest book, Douglas. That is a very great act of kindness. It's about Magellan, the man who's credited with planning the first circumnavigation of the world, and that voyage started in 1519 and ended in 1522. And he's usually hailed as one of, the sort of great scientific navigators in the history of the world who contributed enormously to the emergence of modern science. Nothing could be further from the truth. And morally, he was a much worse guy than Columbus. I mean, he really does do stuff that Columbus never did.
What sort of things?
Like burning indigenous villages, massacring people, starting conflicts. He's an explorer who really does set out to found a colony and to be an imperial exploiter of other people's resources.
To become rich.
He also had, Columbus wanted to become rich, and he wanted to become rich by way of trade. Magellan wanted to become rich by way of seizing other people's goods, which is sort of slightly less morally commendable course of action. He also had personal slaves. We've no evidence that Columbus ever had any personal slaves, although he did enslave people within what he thought were the terms that were permitted under the laws of his time. So Magellan's a much worse character morally. He's also a traitor, a murderer, an arsonist, a committer of judicial murder. So the tally of his crimes is pretty condemnatory. He was also a total failure. Columbus didn't succeed in any of his own objectives, but at least he did make this first voyage with the wind at his back. He achieved a great breakthrough in the history of navigation, and he did discover, he literally was the discoverer, not of America obviously, but of viable routes back and forth across the Atlantic. So he really did forge new links between formerly sundered cultures, which transformed for good and ill the history of the world. And Magellan didn't do anything like that. He failed not only in all his objectives, but also in contributing nothing, really, to global history. The idea that because he actually never intended a circumnavigation of the world, that absolutely hadn't occurred to him. It couldn't possibly have occurred to him. His idea was to get in and out as quickly as possible, and indeed the circumnavigation implicitly was ruled out by the instructions that he got from the King of Spain. So the fact the voyage ended in a circumnavigation was an accident that Magellan had never intended. On the way, he loses 90% of his crew. If you take out the guys who are marooned or captured by the enemy or who desert, of the surviving element, once you've taken those out, 90% die, including Magellan himself. And that's a pretty terrible death rate, even by the standard of voyagers of the time. And when his men get back, it doesn't make any difference to people's image of the world, because they still go on believing in this or hoping that the world is much smaller than it was. They still go on pursuing the chimera that Columbus had created of a navigably, graspably small world. And if you look at the maps, that people make after Magellan's voyage, they still show the world shrunk in some relatively narrow Pacific, even though on Magellan's voyage it had taken him 90 days to cross the Pacific, and they'd run out of food, so that they were eating, that was chewing on the leather that they'd stripped from the linings of the mast, and rats were selling for 12 ducats a piece, which is a fantastic sum, and they'd run out of water. They were drinking this putrid water, and of course many of them were dying. So in spite of the fact that their experiences showed that the Pacific was this huge ocean, the message didn't get across to the European scientific community. So really the effects of Magellan's voyage were pretty much negative. I mean, a few voyagers were sent in his wake in the hope that somebody could do better, right, following the same route, but in fact nobody could, and no commercial advantages ever accrued to his successors. So it was pretty much total disaster, a romantic disaster. I mean, a great tragedy, which in the book I, rather go to town.
Yes, you say you lance that.
To communicate all these horrors to the reader. But I think it makes rattling good history.
Yes.
In that sense, but. Didn't make a great deal of difference to the world.
How is it that all of these reputations, these very different people with very different attitudes, have sort of got wrapped up together? Magellan, for instance, I suspect that, of those who know him today, relatively few will know what a kind of villain he was, but he gets wrapped up with Columbus. Everything in the Age of Explorers is sort of has got merged somehow.
Yes, the paradox is it's got nothing to do with the facts. Magellan, it's very hard to say that about Magellan. And yet, Columbus, the guys are tearing down his statues, they're besmirching his reputation, they're smattering him with obloquy, they're treating him as if he were some kind of proto-fascist. And yet Magellan, who really was a bad guy, has escaped all that. His statues are intact.
Yeah.
Nobody is saying, let's tear down his statues. Nobody is saying, let's, revise his reputation, except I suppose me. No one is saying, why don't we right the injustices that are accrued from Magellan's voyage? In fact, quite the contrary. There are all these scientific prizes and university programs and whole, species and constellations named after Magellan. And nobody is saying, let's, take those, to change those names. So it's quite amazing. The relatively good guy gets all the brickbats and the relatively bad guy gets all the praise. And I think the reason, it's very hard to explain that, but I think it's an example of how prejudice is inviolable by fact, and that no matter what the truth is of an episode in the past, people decide what they think about it on the basis of their prejudices and on the basis of what it does for their own programs and agendas. And it's very unfortunate that Columbus has become the victim of specifically American agendas to do with Native American identity and slavery, things that he really had nothing to do with, but which have become associated with him historically in the course of, a long, sort of unfolding historiographical story between his day and ours, whereas Magellan didn't make any contribution to the United States, never got anywhere near here, and is therefore pretty much ignored by public opinion in America.
Your own university has had an eruption recently of Columbusophobia.
Oh God, please don't remind me. This is a really distressing thing to me that a university, and my own university, should behave so irrationally and should make such terrible concessions to ignorance.
What has it
as
done?
Literally to smother our Columbus murals in the main building of the University of Notre Dame in the 1880s, in celebration of the fact that the university in those days wanted to be a beacon for the moral improvement of America and to deliver a sort of apostolic America that would be better than Europe. They chose Columbus as an image, to represent this, because he was the man who brought Catholicism to the New World.
And in the late 19th century, this wasn't by any means an unusual view of Columbus.
No, on the contrary. I mean, it was the reason they chose Columbus was that he was a universal hero. In those days, everybody in America loved Columbus, although he was primarily, obviously, an Italian-American hero. He was also the hero of everybody, because the founding fathers, the great patriots, had adopted him as a sort of honorary patron. Jefferson had his bust in Monticello. Gerald Varley wrote this sort of epic poem about him in which he's the sort of forerunner of the United States. So everybody loved him, and to such an extent that even communities in the United States that had nothing to do with Columbus tried to appropriate him, very often by forging documents which associated him with them. So you get a Jewish Columbus, a Portuguese Columbus, a Spanish Columbus, you can get an English, Scottish, Polish Columbus. The guy is really Italian, but they all wanted a piece of him. You see. So actually, in the age, and of course, the Columbian Exhibition in Chicago was coming up. It was going to take place in 1892 to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's transatlantic crossing. So at Notre Dame, it made absolute sense to focus this effort to create a sort of series of icons associating America with moral superiority, focus that on Columbus. And the result is that actually the image of the Native Americans in those murals is very positive. I mean, they're shown as these tall, magnificently dressed characters who appear with their weapons before the King and Queen of Spain and really treated as superior to the European figures who surround them in the painting. They're showing compassion and charity and mercy towards Columbus when he's down on his luck, and the Spaniards have turned against him, and he's in disgrace as he was for a period towards the end of his life. So the image that these paintings convey of the Native Americans is actually an image of moral superiority. The paintings aren't historically accurate. They're not meant to be historically accurate. They're meant to reflect this sort of moral message for their own times. But alas, people have looked at them with, I think, prejudiced eyes on the basis of those false accounts of Columbus that you mentioned that became very popular in the 1990s and that warped Americans' understanding of this episode in history and warped their understanding of what Columbus really did and what he was really like. And people have seen the paintings through that filter and have claimed, in many cases, that they find them offensive, which is mad. Because what the painter was trying to do was the opposite of offending anybody. And if you look at them and you're offended, it's because you're not understanding them, you're not looking at them objectively or clearly. And really, I think anybody who looks at these paintings and is offended by them is actually probably morally responsible for his or her own offence. It's not the fault of the guys who created and commissioned the works.
But they're covered up now.
They're also very important educationally and historically. But because of people complaining about them, the university decided to cover them up. It was, of course, after the George Floyd incident, which clearly Columbus had nothing to do with, but by virtue of unclear thinking, the distinction between Columbus and people who really were responsible for the tragedy and mistreatment of George Floyd and other black people in America, that kind of somehow got merged into an incoherent muddle in people's minds. The university could partly, I suppose, for fear that the murals would be the object of violence, and partly in deference to people who claimed that they were offended by them, decided to cover them up. And that was, in my opinion, a rather sad decision. But the worst thing about it is that they covered them up in a way that has actually damaged them. The whole thing was done so thoughtlessly and in such a hurry that they've covered them in a way that A, has caused them serious damage. So a lot of the paint has been scraped away on the paint surface. And in the second place, I mean, not as bad as damaging them, it's made it impossible really for these paintings to be exposed in their entirety for teaching and research, which was one of the things that the president of the university was very keen should be preserved. So total disaster. Am I allowed to use the phrase cock up on your...
You can use it as much as you like.
Okay, well, in that case, probably I should have used it many times already. This is a total travesty, and somehow or other, it seems impossible to put it right, because now surely there's an opportunity to put this right and to change. If we've got to keep them covered, let's change the method by which they're covered for one which doesn't cause any damage and which involves the restoration of the paintings to their former state.
Just one example, but one of literally hundreds of examples one could give of the way in which Columbus is treated, let's say regarded today in America and the West in general. We seem to have decided that after a period of great celebration of Columbus, as you mentioned, there was a period by the 400th anniversary of his arrival in America, there was a period where everyone wanted a part of him. Now it's as if nobody wants anything to do with him.
Well, except Italian Americans and many of my fellow Hispanics who still identify with him. I mean, the reason we have Columbus Day, and the reason why we have most of those monuments, all the ones in Notre Dame, and most of the statues, except in Puerto Rico, but on the mainland, most of the statues were the result of Italian-American sentiment and investment in this purported link between their own ancestors and the incorporation of the Americas into Western civilization. That's really what stimulated the Columbus statues. And the reason we have Columbus Day was, again, it was a gesture of amity towards the Italian-American community in this country after an episode, I think it was the worst episode actually of lynching ever in terms of the number of people lynched in the United States. The victims were not black in that case, they were Italian Americans. So Columbus Day was really an act of national reconciliation, which was an attempt to bring everybody together around this figure and to show that Italian Americans and Catholics, because it was also a time of nativism, anti-Catholicism, and know-nothing movement, all that stuff, to show that Italians and Catholics were welcome in America. They could be, real patriotic all-American guys, even if they weren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So it was Columbus Day was a really important act of national reconciliation. And what distresses me about people who want to delete Columbus Day, cancel it, if you like, in your language, and tear down all the statues, it's not, I don't mind their being wrong about Columbus, I don't mind their being ill-informed or ignorant, I don't mind them hating him or exaggerating his vices. What really upsets me is that they're creating a hierarchy of offence by saying that in order not to offend me, I'm going to tear down your monuments, without realizing that many of us, especially Italian Americans and some of my fellow Hispanics, are as emotionally committed to these monuments as other communities in America are to theirs.
Yes.
And I just wish we had, a tolerant America in which we could all accept each other's monuments and contribute to them and pay them such reverence as is due to them. And if we've got an imbalance, I mean, there are a lot of Columbus statues, I admit that. If there's an imbalance, the way to address it isn't to tear down the existing statues and monuments, but to build others. And in my own university, Notre Dame, these murals that we've covered up are the only tribute we have on the campus to the Native American past. There's one other painting of the first president of Notre Dame celebrating an Indigenous wedding. but nobody sees that painting as it's in one of the residence halls. Apart from that, the Columbus murals were the only celebration, commemorative monument that we had to the Native American past. I think we should have had some more, you know, not covered up the ones we had, but added to them with some, you know, other monuments that really do celebrate the Native American contribution and past, which is a very great past and a very wonderful contribution. But no, apparently we can't live in that world. We can't live in a world of mutual respect and tolerance and pluralism. We have to destroy each other's monuments in order to gratify our own offence. To me, that is not just crazy, it's actually wicked.
When you think back now, and when we look back at this whole age of the explorers, what do you think that our attitude towards them should be today?
I don't think we should have an attitude. I mean, I don't mind. As I say, people can hate them if they want to. That's entirely up to them. And I don't want to stop anybody hating explorers. I don't want to stop them hating me, you know. I'm a Catholic, and I regard it as an obligation of Christian charity to let other people hate me if that's what turns them on. That's great, you know. Go on, hate as much as you like, but don't impose your agenda on me. And don't make me cover up my monuments, cancel my past, destroy my own comforting beliefs, faith and myths if they really contribute to me. I'm willing to respect yours. So I don't think we should have an attitude to these guys, or if we have an attitude, I'm perfectly content to leave it intact. I think what we really should do is concentrate on knowing the truth about them. That's my vocation as an historian. Not to pursue an agenda, not to advocate an attitude, but to tell the truth and give people the facts on which they ought to make their decisions. Because God knows, you know, facts are often very ungratifying and they're often, you know, very unwelcome. But they're the only basis on which you can make a rational decision. At least if you make your decision on the basis of the facts, you know, it might turn out to be a good decision, not necessarily. But, you know, it's more likely to be a right decision if it's based on the facts than if it's based on fiction. So my view is, let's concentrate on trying to learn the truth and for God's sake, you know, stop letting these prejudices getting in the way of our acknowledgement of the facts.
Felipe Fernández-Armesto, thank you.
Thank you.